On the morning of December 7th, 1941, life in the United States was still ordinary. Men were finishing breakfast, families were heading to church, children were playing in the yard. By noon, nothing would ever be the same. But what came after the attack on Pearl Harbor wasn't just a declaration of war. It was the sudden, violent collapse of a belief that tens of millions of Americans had held with absolute certainty. The belief that this war, if it ever touched them at all, would be short, clean, finished before the snow fell again. They were wrong. And the story of how wrong they were and what that cost is one of the most haunting chapters in American history. To understand what shattered on December 7th, 1941, you first have to understand what Americans believed before that day. Throughout the late 1930s, the United States had watched Europe descend into chaos with a kind of detached dread. Hitler had marched into Poland in September 1939, France had fallen in 1940, Britain was being bombed from the air, and still the prevailing mood in America, particularly across the Midwest and the South, was deliberate distance. This was Europe's war. It had nothing to do with them. The isolationist movement was not a fringe position. It was mainstream, deeply rooted, and politically powerful. The America First Committee, founded in 1940, had hundreds of thousands of members. Prominent figures, intellectuals, veterans, and businessmen argued that the United States had no place in another foreign conflict. The memories of the First World War were still raw. Over 116,000 Americans had died in that war, and many felt the nation had gained little in return. Roosevelt understood the gravity of what was happening. He had quietly begun moving the country toward readiness. The Lend-Lease Act of 1941 allowed the U.S. to supply Britain and its allies without formally entering the conflict. But in a fireside chat in December 1940, he described the United States as the arsenal of democracy, a nation that would arm others but not yet send its sons. That balance depended on one thing: keeping America out of direct conflict. And then Japan made that impossible. What happened in Hawaii on the morning of December 7th was not simply an attack, it was the exposure of a failure, one that went far deeper than a missed radar blip. At 7:48 in the morning, local Hawaiian time, the first wave of Japanese aircraft reached Pearl Harbor. There were 353 planes in total, launched from 6 aircraft carriers positioned roughly 230 miles north of the Hawaiian island of Oahu. The attack had been in planning for months. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet, had designed the strike specifically to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet before America could interfere with Japan's military expansion across Southeast Asia. In under 2 hours, 2,403 Americans were killed. Another 1,178 were wounded. 18 ships were sunk or heavily damaged, including 8 battleships. The USS Arizona sank in less than 9 minutes after a bomb detonated its forward ammunition magazine. Nearly 1,177 of the ship's crew died with it. The USS Oklahoma capsized with hundreds of men still trapped inside. 402 of them never made it out. The U.S. Army Air Corps lost 188 aircraft, most of them destroyed on the ground before pilots could even reach their cockpits. What made the attack especially devastating wasn't just the firepower Japan brought to bear. It was the complete surprise. American radar operators had actually detected the incoming planes early that morning. A junior officer, informed of the radar contact, assumed it was a flight of American B-17 bombers expected from the mainland and told his men not to worry about it. No alert was issued, no planes scrambled. By the time anyone understood what was happening, the bombs were already falling. But here is something most people don't realize about Pearl Harbor. Despite the catastrophic losses, Japan failed to destroy the one asset that would ultimately decide the war in the Pacific. The American aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, the USS Lexington, and the USS Saratoga, were all at sea or in port elsewhere that day. They survived. And it was those carriers, not the battleships at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, that would form the backbone of the American counteroffensive. Yamamoto himself, upon hearing the full results of the attack, reportedly remarked that they had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Within hours of Roosevelt's address, men across America were making a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Most of them made it in minutes. Across the United States, people learned about Pearl Harbor in different ways and at different moments throughout December 7th. Those on the East Coast first heard bulletins interrupt regular radio programming in the early afternoon. In the Midwest, families sitting down to Sunday lunch heard the news crackling through their living room speakers. On the West Coast, it was still morning when the reports came in, and the initial reaction was disbelief. Many people thought it was another radio drama, another broadcast stunt gone wrong. It wasn't. By evening, it was clear to everyone. And on the morning of December 8th, President Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered one of the most consequential addresses in American history. He described December 7th as a date which would live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan within hours. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 3 days later, on December 11th, and Congress responded in kind that same afternoon. In a matter of days, the United States was at war on two separate fronts, across two oceans, against three industrialized nations. The men who had assumed they would never have to go now understood that they almost certainly would. Enlistment offices opened on December 8th and found lines stretching down the block. In the first week after Pearl Harbor, over 100,000 men volunteered. Some offices stayed open through the night. Many were young, teenagers in some cases, barely out of high school, and came with the absolute certainty that this war would be over quickly. America was powerful. America would win fast. Among them was a 19-year-old from Rockford, Illinois, named Glenn Frazier, who would spend the next 3.5 years as a prisoner of war in the Philippines. There was Lester Tenney, a tank driver from Chicago who enlisted days after Pearl Harbor, made it to Bataan, and survived the Death March, only to spend years in Japanese labor camps. There were thousands like them, each carrying the same assumption when they left. They told their families not to worry. They'd be home by Christmas. The men who said that had no way of knowing what was already waiting for them on the other side of the Pacific. The military did, and it had been keeping that knowledge very close. While civilians lined up at recruitment offices, the men responsible for actually waging the war were confronting a very different reality. The United States military in December 1941 was not ready for a large-scale global conflict. The Army had been expanded through the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940, the first peacetime draft in American history. But many of those draftees were still in early training. Equipment was scarce. Some artillery units were conducting exercises with wooden replicas of weapons that hadn't yet been manufactured in sufficient numbers. The situation in the Pacific was particularly grim. General Douglas MacArthur commanded American and Filipino forces in the Philippines. He had been warned a Japanese attack was coming. Nevertheless, when Japanese bombers struck his airfields on the afternoon of December 8th, hours after Pearl Harbor, they found American planes still on the ground and destroyed a substantial portion of the air defenses in a single pass. It was, in nearly every respect, a repeat of what had just happened in Hawaii. MacArthur's forces retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and held out for months under disease, starvation, and relentless pressure. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to evacuate in March 1942. He left behind approximately 76,000 Filipino and American soldiers, the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. The Bataan Death March forced those prisoners to walk approximately 65 miles in extreme heat to a prison camp, with almost no food or water. An estimated 5,000 to 18,000 Filipinos and up to 650 Americans died during the march itself. Thousands more perished in the camps that followed. None of this was what the men who had enlisted in December 1941 had imagined when they said their goodbyes. The war was consuming men faster than most families could process, and the government had devised a system for telling them. One so clinical, it became the most feared object in America. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the United States began converting itself into the largest war production machine in human history. Automobile factories stopped making cars and started making tanks and aircraft. Consumer goods that Americans had taken for granted, rubber, gasoline, nylon, sugar, butter, meat, were rationed. Victory gardens appeared in backyards and public parks. Women entered the workforce in numbers that had never been seen before, taking jobs in shipyards, aircraft plants, and munitions factories. The image of Rosie the Riveter, introduced in a 1943 poster campaign, became an enduring symbol of that transformation. But alongside this mobilization came something more troubling, a wave of fear and suspicion that the government channeled in directions that remain controversial to this day. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing the forced relocation of over 120,000 Japanese Americans on the West Coast into internment camps across the interior United States. Roughly two-thirds were American citizens by birth. They were given days to dispose of their property before being transported to facilities surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The justification was military necessity, that Japanese Americans posed a potential security threat. No credible evidence of sabotage or espionage was ever found. The Supreme Court upheld the order in the 1944 case Korematsu versus United States, a ruling not formally repudiated until 2018. The federal government did not formally apologize or provide reparations to surviving internees until 1988. German Americans and Italian Americans were not subjected to mass internment. The targeted treatment of Japanese Americans reflected racial anxieties present in American society long before Pearl Harbor. Anxieties the war gave the government license to act upon. The home front was not simply a story of unity and shared sacrifice, it was also a story of who that sacrifice was demanded from. While that machinery of fear was running on the home front, the men overseas were encountering a different kind of reality. One the censors were actively working to keep out of American living rooms. The first year of American involvement in the war was defined more by setbacks than victories. In the Pacific, after the fall of the Philippines, U.S. forces engaged Japanese troops in a grinding 6-month campaign around the island of Guadalcanal beginning in August 1942. 7 major naval engagements were fought. American forces ultimately prevailed, but the cost was over 7,000 Americans killed, 29 ships lost, and more than 600 aircraft destroyed. The fighting on the island itself, dense jungle, tropical disease, an enemy that held ground with extraordinary tenacity, was unlike anything American soldiers had trained for. In North Africa, the first large-scale American ground engagement came in November 1942 with Operation Torch. American forces performed unevenly. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in Tunisia in February 1943, German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel drove American troops back in a defeat that exposed serious problems with training, coordination, and leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower used it as a catalyst for sweeping changes in how American units were organized and led. These were not the decisive victories the men at the recruitment offices had imagined. They were grinding campaigns measured in miles and months. Back home, the letters arriving from overseas told parts of this story, carefully, because military censors reviewed all correspondence. Families read between the lines. The tone of letters from men in the Pacific shifted as the months went on. The early confidence gave way to something quieter, harder to name. The Christmas of 1942 came and went. The men were not home. For the families still waiting at home, the war had settled into a particular kind of dread. Not dramatic, not sudden, but steady. The kind that lives in the sound of a doorbell. During the Second World War, the United States War Department delivered casualty notifications by telegram. The sight of a Western Union messenger walking up to a front door became one of the most dreaded images of the war years. Families with men overseas learned to watch the street, to feel something drop in their chest when someone in a uniform appeared at the gate. Neighbors sometimes saw the messenger first and came to sit with the family before anyone had said a word. In small towns, word of a death could reach an entire community in hours. The telegram was brief. It stated that the soldier, sailor, or airman had been killed in action, wounded, or was missing. Missing in action could be harder to bear than a confirmed death. It left families in uncertainty that stretched for years. Some never received a definitive answer. Over 405,000 Americans died during the Second World War. Each death sent a telegram to someone, a mother, a wife, a father, a sibling. In the particular, each one was a world ending. Gold Star mothers, women who had lost a son, became a recognized presence in American communities. The Gold Star flag in a window told everyone who passed what the house had given. By the end of the war, an estimated 670,000 had been displayed across the country. The scale of American grief was real, but so was something else. A production capacity so vast, it was rewriting what was possible. The country that had been caught sleeping in December 1941 was building its way toward a reckoning. Whatever the early failures, the United States possessed one advantage that no military setback could erase: industrial capacity on a scale no other nation in the war could match. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced over 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 2.4 million military trucks, and 8,800 naval vessels. The Liberty Ship program launched a new cargo vessel every 42 days in 1941. By 1943, that had dropped to under a month. One vessel, the SS Robert E. Peary, was assembled in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Henry Kaiser, who oversaw much of the program, had no prior shipbuilding experience. He applied automobile assembly line principles to ocean-going vessels. It worked in a way that surprised even him. Through Lend-Lease, the United States also shipped enormous quantities of war materiel to Britain, the Soviet Union, China, and dozens of other nations. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, at a wartime dinner with Allied leaders, raised a toast to American production and acknowledged that without it, the Soviet Union could not have sustained its war in the East. By 1943, the strategic picture had shifted. Allied forces broke the German lines at El Alamein in November 1942. The German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad in February 1943. The Allies landed in Sicily that July. In the Pacific, the island-by-island advance was closing the distance to Japan. The war was not over, but its eventual direction had become, for those reading the maps clearly, discernible. The maps were turning, but the men who had to walk across those maps had no view of the larger picture. They only knew what was directly in front of them, and what was directly in front of them in the summer of 1944 was a beach called Omaha, Normandy, Iwo Jima, Anzio, the Hurtgen Forest, Peleliu. These names meant nothing to most Americans before the war. By the time the war ended, they carried the weight of everything. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the Allies launched the largest amphibious operation in history against German-occupied France. Over 156,000 troops landed on 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. American forces hit 2, Utah and Omaha. Utah went relatively well. Omaha did not. Much of the disaster at Omaha was built into the plan before a single boat hit the shore. The specialized tanks meant to provide cover, duplex-drive Shermans, modified to float, were launched too far out in conditions too rough for them. Of the 29 tanks launched toward Omaha's Dog Green sector, 27 sank before reaching the beach. The infantry went in without them. The 116th Infantry Regiment, drawn largely from men in Bedford, Virginia, a town of roughly 3,200 people, lost 19 men in the first 15 minutes. Bedford suffered the highest D-Day losses of any community in the United States, proportionally. The town has never entirely stopped measuring itself against that morning. Those who reached the beach found themselves pinned against a seawall with no clear orders and fire coming from multiple directions. What broke the deadlock was not a coordinated assault. It was individuals, sergeants, and privates acting without instruction who climbed the bluffs in small groups and attacked the gun positions from the flanks. The cost at Omaha alone was approximately 2,000 casualties in a single day. Across all 5 beaches, Allied losses totaled between 10,000 and 12,000, including roughly 4,400 confirmed deaths. In the Pacific, the Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March of 1945 became a symbol of the war's grinding logic. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island needed as an emergency landing strip for damaged American bombers. The Japanese garrison had fortified it with an elaborate network of tunnels, bunkers, and concealed positions, designed to make taking the island cost more than it was worth. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Americans were killed. Almost the entire Japanese garrison of over 20,000 men died, most refusing to surrender. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi was taken on the 5th day, while heavy fighting was still ongoing. Admiral Chester Nimitz wrote of Iwo Jima that uncommon valor was a common virtue. The phrase has never been improved upon. By the spring of 1945, the question was no longer whether Japan would be defeated. It was what defeating Japan would actually cost, and who would bear that cost. The answer was unlike anything anyone had imagined in December 1941. By the summer of 1945, Germany had surrendered. Hitler had taken his own life on April 30th. Berlin fell to Soviet forces on May 2nd, and the war in Europe was over on May 8th, VE Day. The war in the Pacific continued. Japan showed no sign of accepting unconditional surrender. American military planners were developing Operation Downfall, a full-scale invasion of the Japanese home islands. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where over 12,000 Americans were killed and kamikaze tactics had proven devastatingly effective, had already shown what that invasion would cost. President Harry Truman, who had assumed the presidency upon Roosevelt's death in April 1945, was briefed on the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program to develop an atomic weapon. 2 bombs had been assembled. On July 26, 1945, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, warning Japan of destruction if it refused to surrender. Japan did not formally respond. What is less commonly discussed is the nature of Truman's deliberation. Operation Downfall called for 2 phases: landings on Kyushu in November 1945, then Honshu in the spring of 1946. Planners projected Allied casualties for the first phase alone at between 130,000 and 220,000. Japanese civilian losses under either invasion or continued conventional bombing were projected to far exceed that. Truman later wrote that he acted to end the war and save lives on both sides. Whether that accounting holds has been argued by historians ever since. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. The explosion killed an estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people immediately. By the end of 1945, the death toll from the blast and its long-term effects had risen to between 90,000 and 166,000. The city was largely obliterated. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki, killing an estimated 40,000 people immediately and ultimately between 60,000 and 80,000 by year's end. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the Japanese people by radio for the first time in history, announcing acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration terms and citing the new weapon as among the reasons. The formal surrender was signed aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, VJ Day. The Second World War was over. From the morning of December 7, 1941 to September 2, 1945 was 3 years, 8 months, and 26 days. Some of the men who had said they'd be home by Christmas made it home eventually. Many had not. All of them had been changed by what happened in the years between. The war was over, but the men coming home were not the same men who had left. And the country they were returning to had changed just as much, in ways that took decades to fully understand. Over 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the Second World War. Over 405,000 did not return. Of those who did, many carried wounds that were not visible, the psychological aftermath of years of combat, captivity, and loss. Veterans were expected to come home, pick up their lives, and move forward. Many tried, many struggled in silence for years without ever being able to fully explain to their families what they had experienced. The VA hospital system was overwhelmed. Psychiatric wards were packed. The term combat fatigue was used in place of anything more precise, and treatment was limited at best. The GI Bill, formerly the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, was signed into law in June 1944 before the war ended. Its passage was not without controversy. Southern Democrats had pushed for a version allowing individual states to administer the benefits, which in practice would have let those states exclude black veterans. The federal compromise that passed was better, but implementation was uneven enough that the outcomes remained deeply unequal. Black veterans applying for college benefits were often directed toward historically black colleges that were already overcrowded and underfunded. Those seeking mortgage provisions found that private bank redlining and racial covenants on new suburban developments made the benefits inaccessible across much of the country. The GI Bill built the post-war middle class. It did not build it equally. Nearly 8 million veterans used the education benefits. Millions more used the housing provisions to move into newly built suburbs. The transformation of the American landscape in the late 1940s and 1950s. The rows of identical houses, the new schools, the expanding highways, was inseparable from the decisions made to bring those men home and give them something to return to. Glenn Frazier, the 19-year-old from Rockford who had said he'd be home by Christmas, came back to the United States in 1945 after more than 3 years as a prisoner of war. He spent decades afterward unable to talk about what he had experienced. He eventually wrote a memoir published in 2009. Lester Tenney, the tank driver from Chicago who survived the Bataan Death March, spent years fighting for compensation from the Japanese companies that had used American prisoners as forced labor. He received a formal apology from Japan in 2010, 65 years after the war ended. When Glenn Frazier left for the Philippines in 1941, he was 19 years old and certain the war would be brief. When he came home, he was 23 and spent decades not speaking about what had happened in between. When Lester Tenney came back from Bataan and the labor camps, he spent the better part of his remaining life seeking accountability that came only at the very end of it. Neither man was celebrated. Neither man was easily understood by the people around them. They were just men who had gone and then returned, carrying something they hadn't left with. That is the actual shape of the story. Not a generation of heroes marching in formation, but millions of individuals, most of them ordinary, most of them young, most of them wrong about how long it would take, who got caught inside a historical event they had not chosen and could not control. The promise that they'd be home by Christmas was not naive. It was human. It was the thing you said to the person you were leaving behind when you had no other honest answer to give. The war took that promise and stretched it across years, across oceans, across experiences that had no language ready for them when the men finally returned. What came back was not what left. That is true of the men, and it is true of the country. Whether what came back was better is a harder question. One the history does not resolve cleanly, and one that deserves more than a clean resolution. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.